What if I told you that hidden beneath centuries of religious doctrine lies a forbidden book so controversial that most Christians have never heard of it? A text that claims to reveal the untold story of what really happened to Adam and Eve after they were banished from paradise. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most suppressed texts, the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, a book so dangerous that religious authorities have spent centuries trying to keep it buried. But before we begin this journey into forbidden knowledge, I need you to understand something crucial. What you're about to discover isn't just ancient mythology. It's a window into beliefs that were once considered sacred truth by entire communities. Stories that reveal a side of biblical history your Sunday school teacher never told you about. And if you're here, if something drew you to click on this video, then you're ready to explore the shadowy corners of religious literature that most people never dare to examine. The book we're discussing tonight doesn't appear in any mainstream Bible. It's not taught in seminaries. It's not quoted from pulpits. Yet this ancient text contains some of the most vivid, detailed, and frankly disturbing accounts of humanity's earliest struggles that have ever been written. We're talking about stories that make the brief Genesis account look like a children's bedtime story in comparison. So let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered what really happened after Adam and Eve left Eden? The Bible gives us just a few verses about their exile. But what if there were hundreds of pages describing their daily battles with despair, their encounters with demonic forces, their desperate attempts to find God again? What if there were detailed accounts of how Cain and Abel really lived, how they really died, and what cosmic forces were pulling the strings behind humanity's first murder? That curiosity you're feeling right now? That's exactly what drove ancient communities to preserve this forbidden text through centuries of persecution and suppression. Because the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan doesn't just fill in the gaps left by Genesis. It completely transforms our understanding of what the earliest humans experienced after losing paradise. Now, before we dive deeper into this rabbit hole, if you're ready to uncover more hidden texts and forbidden knowledge that challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what we're exploring tonight is just the tip of an iceberg that goes much deeper than most people are prepared to follow. Here's what makes this particular text so fascinating and so controversial. Unlike the carefully edited, theologically sanitized accounts we're familiar with, the conflict of Adam and Eve reads like a horror novel mixed with spiritual warfare manual. We're talking about detailed descriptions of Satan's psychological torture methods, vivid accounts of Adam and Eve's mental breakdowns, and cosmic battles that make modern fantasy novels look tame by comparison. The origins of this text are as mysterious as its contents. Most scholars believe it emerged from Egyptian Christian communities sometime in the early centuries after Christ, originally written in Arabic before being translated into Ethiopic. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't some fringe document created by a single eccentric writer. Evidence suggests it was part of a broader tradition of Adam and Eve literature that was widely circulated and deeply respected in certain Christian communities. Think about that for a moment. Entire communities of believers considered these stories to be authentic accounts of humanity's earliest history. They didn't see them as fiction or folklore. They viewed them as sacred truth that had been passed down through generations, preserving details that the canonical scriptures had somehow omitted or lost. But then something changed. As Christianity became more organized, more institutional, more concerned with establishing orthodox doctrine. Texts like the conflict of Adam and Eve began to be viewed with suspicion. Church authorities started asking uncomfortable questions. If these stories were true, why weren't they included in the official canon? If they weren't true, why were people treating them as sacred scripture? The answer reveals something profound about how religious institutions handle uncomfortable truths. Rather than engage with the challenging spiritual insights these texts contained, rather than grapple with the complex theological questions they raised, the institutional response was simpler. Suppress them. Declare them non-canonical. Label them as pseudepigraphal, meaning falsely attributed to ancient figures. But suppression rarely destroys truth entirely. It just drives it underground. And that's exactly what happened with the conflict of Adam and Eve. While official Christianity moved toward simplified doctrines and institutional control, this forbidden text survived in manuscript traditions, preserved by communities that refused to let these stories die. What they preserved is extraordinary. We're talking about a narrative that spans decades of Adam and Eve's post-Eden existence. Detailed accounts of their psychological trauma, their spiritual struggles, their ongoing battles with demonic forces that most Christians never hear about. Stories that reveal the true cost of humanity's separation from divine perfection. The text opens with Adam and Eve standing outside the gates of paradise. And what follows is unlike anything in mainstream religious literature. We see them not as distant biblical figures, but as broken human beings struggling with depression, despair, and spiritual confusion. We witness their attempts to recreate the worship they once knew in Eden, only to discover that everything has changed. The very ground beneath their feet has become hostile. The animals that once served them now fear them. The spiritual realm that was once transparent has become a battlefield. And Satan? In this text, Satan isn't the cartoon villain with horns and a pitchfork that popular culture has created. He's a sophisticated psychological manipulator who understands human weakness better than humans understand themselves. The conflict of Adam and Eve reveals Satan's methods in disturbing detail, showing how he exploits grief, amplifies despair, and turns humanity's greatest strengths into sources of destruction. But here's what makes this text truly dangerous to institutional religion. It doesn't present Satan as some external enemy that believers can simply avoid or resist through proper doctrine. Instead, it reveals him as a force that operates through the very psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that make us human. The real conflict isn't between good and evil in some abstract sense. It's between our divine potential and our fallen nature, played out in the daily struggles of consciousness itself. This understanding of spiritual warfare goes far deeper than anything most believers encounter in conventional religious teaching. We're not talking about simple temptation and resistance. We're talking about a cosmic battle for the very nature of human consciousness, fought on psychological and spiritual battlefields that most people don't even know exist. The accounts of Cain and Abel in this forbidden text are particularly revealing. While Genesis gives us just a few verses about their story, the conflict of Adam and Eve provides hundreds of pages exploring the psychological, spiritual, and cosmic forces that led to humanity's first murder. We see how Satan manipulated their personalities, exploited their differences, and turned brother against brother through methods so subtle that even Adam and Eve didn't recognize what was happening until it was too late. These aren't just ancient stories about people who lived thousands of years ago. They're psychological profiles of how evil operates in human relationships, how spiritual forces exploit family dynamics, how the very bonds that should unite us can become weapons of destruction when influenced by malevolent intelligence. But the text goes even further. It reveals that the conflict between Cain and Abel wasn't just a family tragedy. It was part of a larger cosmic strategy designed to corrupt the human race at its source. Satan understood that if he could turn the first brothers against each other, he could establish patterns of violence and betrayal that would echo through all human history. And according to this forbidden text, that's exactly what happened. The murder of Abel wasn't just the first crime. It was the first victory in a systematic campaign to transform humanity from beings capable of divine union into creatures trapped in cycles of violence, deception, and spiritual blindness. This is why religious authorities found the conflict of Adam and Eve so threatening. It doesn't just tell us what happened in humanity's earliest days. It reveals ongoing spiritual realities that most believers are never taught to recognize or resist. It exposes the sophisticated methods that destructive forces use to manipulate human consciousness, exploit psychological vulnerabilities, and turn our greatest gifts into sources of suffering. The text describes in vivid detail how Adam and Eve experienced what we might now call post-traumatic stress disorder after their expulsion from Eden. We see them struggling with flashbacks to their former perfection, experiencing panic attacks when they encounter reminders of what they've lost, falling into deep depressions that last for months at a time. But this isn't just psychological realism. According to the text, their trauma was being deliberately amplified by demonic forces that understood exactly how to exploit their emotional wounds. Satan appears to them disguised as an angel of light, offering false comfort that actually deepens their despair. He creates illusions of paradise that torture them with memories of what they can never regain. He whispers lies about God's character that poison their ability to trust divine love. These psychological warfare tactics described in the forbidden text are so sophisticated, so precisely targeted to human weakness, that they read like a manual for spiritual manipulation. And perhaps that's exactly what they were intended to be. Not just stories about ancient people, but warnings about ongoing spiritual realities that every human being must learn to navigate. The level of detail in these accounts is both fascinating and disturbing. We learn about the specific methods Satan uses to amplify guilt, how he exploits the differences between Adam and Eve to create marital conflict, how he uses their children's personalities as weapons against family unity. We see him creating false spiritual experiences designed to confuse their understanding of divine truth, manufacturing counterfeit miracles that lead them further from genuine relationship with God. What emerges from these forbidden pages is a picture of spiritual warfare that's far more complex and psychologically sophisticated than anything most believers are prepared to handle. This isn't the simple battle between obvious good and obvious evil that Sunday school stories describe. This is subtle psychological manipulation by intelligence that has studied human nature for millennia and knows exactly how to exploit our deepest vulnerabilities. But the text also reveals something else. Despite the sophistication of these attacks, despite the overwhelming nature of their spiritual opposition, Adam and Eve don't simply surrender to despair. The conflict of Adam and Eve shows them developing strategies for spiritual survival, learning to recognize deception, finding ways to maintain hope even in the darkest circumstances. They discover that their connection to divine truth isn't completely severed by their exile from Eden. It's damaged, complicated, often obscured by their emotional trauma and Satan's deceptions, but it's not destroyed. The text describes moments of genuine spiritual breakthrough when they manage to perceive divine presence despite their fallen condition, experiences of grace that sustain them through periods of overwhelming darkness. These glimpses of hope, scattered throughout the forbidden narrative, reveal something profound about human spiritual potential. Even in our most damaged state, even when we're being systematically manipulated by forces of destruction, something within us remains capable of recognizing and responding to divine truth. The image of God within human consciousness may be distorted, but according to this ancient text, it can never be completely eliminated. This understanding has profound implications for how we think about spiritual development, psychological healing, and the nature of human potential itself. If the conflict of Adam and Eve preserves authentic insights about humanity's spiritual condition, then we're dealing with realities that extend far beyond ancient history into the core challenges of human existence. The forbidden text suggests that every human being faces the same basic spiritual conflicts that Adam and Eve encountered after leaving paradise. We all struggle with the gap between our potential and our reality. We all experience psychological manipulation by forces that understand our weaknesses better than we understand them ourselves. We all must learn to distinguish between genuine spiritual experience and sophisticated counterfeits designed to lead us away from truth. But we've only begun to scratch the surface of what this forbidden book reveals. The psychological warfare tactics we've discussed are just the beginning of a much deeper and more disturbing picture of humanity's earliest spiritual battles. The deeper we venture into this forbidden text, the more we encounter something that should terrify anyone who believes human consciousness is simply a product of brain chemistry. Because the conflict of Adam and Eve doesn't just describe psychological manipulation. It reveals something far more unsettling about the nature of reality itself. According to this ancient text, the spiritual realm isn't some distant heaven that we might reach after death. It's a dimension of existence that interpenetrates our physical world at every moment, populated by intelligences that can influence human thought and emotion in ways that most people never recognize. We're not talking about superstition or primitive mythology. We're talking about detailed accounts of how non-physical beings interact with human consciousness through methods that bypass our rational defenses entirely. The text describes how Satan and his forces don't need to possess people in the dramatic way that Hollywood movies portray. Instead, they operate through what we might now call psychological programming, implanting thoughts that feel like our own ideas, amplifying emotions that seem to arise naturally from our circumstances, creating mental patterns that trap us in cycles of destructive behavior without us ever realizing we're being manipulated. Think about the implications of this for a moment. If the conflict of Adam and Eve preserves authentic insights about how spiritual forces operate, then every human being is navigating a battlefield of consciousness that most of us don't even know exists. Every thought we think, every emotion we feel, every decision we make occurs within a context of spiritual influences that we've never been taught to recognize or evaluate. This isn't paranoid thinking. This is sophisticated spiritual psychology that understands consciousness as something far more complex and vulnerable than modern science acknowledges. The forbidden text reveals that human awareness exists at the intersection of multiple dimensions of reality, making us susceptible to influences from realms that materialistic worldviews completely ignore. But here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. The conflict of Adam and Eve suggests that this spiritual manipulation didn't begin with individual temptation. It began with the systematic corruption of human understanding itself. Satan's first and most crucial victory wasn't convincing Adam and Eve to disobey God. It was convincing them to distrust their own spiritual perceptions. The text reveals that before their fall, Adam and Eve possessed what we might call spiritual discernment. They could perceive the true nature of spiritual forces, distinguish between divine and demonic influences, recognize deception regardless of how sophisticated its disguise. But after their exile from Eden, this capacity became damaged, unreliable, easily confused by beings who understood exactly how to exploit their spiritual blindness. This explains why the psychological warfare described in the forbidden text is so effective. It's not just that Satan understands human weakness. It's that he understands how to operate beneath the threshold of human spiritual perception, influencing consciousness through channels that we can no longer clearly detect or defend against. The accounts of how this spiritual blindness affected Adam and Eve's daily life are both heartbreaking and terrifying. We see them struggling to distinguish between genuine divine communication and demonic deception. They hear voices claiming to be God, see visions that appear to be heavenly, experience what seem to be miraculous interventions, only to discover that they've been led further from truth rather than closer to it. But the most devastating aspect of their condition isn't the external attacks they face. It's the internal doubt that Satan's deceptions create about their own spiritual experiences. The text describes how they begin to question every moment of divine connection, every flash of spiritual insight, every sense of God's presence. They become so afraid of being deceived that they start rejecting authentic spiritual experiences along with the false ones. This psychological trap is described in the forbidden text with chilling precision. Satan doesn't need to prevent people from seeking God. He just needs to make them so confused about how to recognize divine truth that they either accept counterfeits or reject the genuine article out of fear of being fooled. Either response serves his purposes equally well. The conflict of Adam and Eve suggests that this spiritual confusion isn't just an ancient problem. It's the fundamental human condition that every person must learn to navigate. We all inherit Adam and Eve's damaged capacity for spiritual discernment. We all struggle to distinguish between authentic divine communication and the sophisticated counterfeits that our consciousness is constantly bombarded with. But the forbidden text doesn't leave us in despair. Hidden within its dark accounts of spiritual warfare are detailed descriptions of how Adam and Eve gradually learned to rebuild their capacity for spiritual discernment. They discovered techniques for testing spiritual experiences, methods for distinguishing between divine and demonic influences, practices for maintaining connection to divine truth even when their perception was clouded by emotional trauma or spiritual attack. These techniques read like an advanced manual for spiritual development, far more sophisticated than anything most believers ever encounter in conventional religious education. We're talking about practices for purifying consciousness, methods for strengthening spiritual perception, techniques for recognizing and resisting psychological manipulation by non-physical intelligences. 2. The text describes how Adam and Eve learned to fast, not just from food, but from the constant mental noise that made spiritual discernment impossible. They discovered that extended periods of silence and solitude could restore their capacity to perceive divine presence beneath the layers of confusion that Satan's attacks had created. They developed practices for emotional purification that cleared away the psychological debris that obscured their spiritual vision. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to work together as a team in their spiritual development, rather than allowing their differences to become sources of division. The forbidden text reveals that one of Satan's most effective strategies was exploiting the natural differences between Adam and Eve's personalities, turning their complementary strengths into sources of conflict and mutual blame. We see this pattern playing out in disturbing detail throughout their post-Eden existence. Satan whispers to Adam that Eve is the source of their problems, that if she hadn't been so easily deceived, they would still be in paradise. He whispers to Eve that Adam is weak and failed to protect her, that his spiritual leadership is the reason for their exile. He amplifies every small disagreement into major conflict, turns every difference of opinion into evidence of fundamental incompatibility. The psychological realism of these accounts is remarkable. We see how spiritual manipulation operates through the normal dynamics of human relationships, how destructive forces exploit the natural tensions that exist between people who are trying to build life together under difficult circumstances. The forbidden text reveals that spiritual warfare isn't primarily about dramatic supernatural encounters. It's about the subtle ways that malevolent intelligence works through ordinary human interactions to create division, resentment, and despair. But the text also shows how Adam and Eve gradually learned to recognize these patterns and develop immunity to them. They discovered that their spiritual battles couldn't be won individually. They needed each other's perspective to maintain clarity about what was really happening in their relationship. They learned to check their perceptions against each other's experiences, to support each other through periods of spiritual confusion, to resist the temptation to blame each other for problems that were actually caused by external spiritual manipulation. This understanding of spiritual partnership described in the forbidden text is far more mature and psychologically sophisticated than the gender roles typically taught in conventional religious communities. We're not talking about hierarchical relationships where one person has authority over another. We're talking about spiritual equality, where different gifts and perspectives are essential for navigating the complexities of human existence in a fallen world. The conflict of Adam and Eve reveals that the complementary nature of masculine and feminine consciousness isn't just about reproduction or social organization. It's about spiritual survival. The text suggests that Adam and Eve each possessed different aspects of spiritual discernment that became essential for recognizing and resisting the various forms of deception they encountered. Adam's spiritual gifts apparently included the ability to perceive the cosmic dimensions of their situation, to understand how their personal struggles connected to larger patterns of spiritual warfare affecting all creation. Eve's gifts included sensitivity to the emotional and relational dimensions of their spiritual battles, the ability to recognize how psychological manipulation was affecting their capacity for love and trust. Neither could navigate their post-Eden existence successfully without the other's perspective. The forbidden text shows them learning to honor and integrate their different spiritual gifts, rather than competing for dominance or trying to eliminate their differences. They discovered that their spiritual maturity depended on becoming more themselves, not more like each other. This vision of spiritual partnership challenges many assumptions about gender roles in religious communities. Rather than presenting women as spiritually subordinate to men, the conflict of Adam and Eve portrays Eve as possessing spiritual capacities that are different from but equal to Adam's gifts. Her insights are essential for their mutual spiritual development, not optional additions to his primary spiritual authority. But the forbidden text goes even further in challenging conventional religious assumptions. It reveals that Adam and Eve's spiritual development didn't follow the linear progression that most believers expect. They didn't simply recover from their fall and gradually return to their former spiritual state. Instead, they underwent a completely different kind of spiritual transformation that was only possible because of their experience of loss and struggle. The text suggests that their exile from Eden, devastating as it was, created opportunities for spiritual growth that wouldn't have existed if they had remained in paradise. Their struggles with Satan's deceptions forced them to develop spiritual muscles that they never needed in their original state of innocence. Their experience of separation from God taught them to value divine connection in ways they couldn't appreciate when it was constant and effortless. This isn't the simple narrative of fall and redemption that most Christians are familiar with. This is a complex story of how consciousness can evolve through suffering, how spiritual maturity can emerge from the very experiences that seem to destroy our connection to divine truth. The conflict of Adam and Eve suggests that human spiritual development follows patterns that are far more mysterious and counterintuitive than conventional religious teaching acknowledges. The accounts of Cain and Abel's upbringing in this forbidden text reveal how these spiritual dynamics played out in the next generation. We see Adam and Eve trying to pass on the spiritual wisdom they had gained through their struggles, attempting to prepare their sons for the spiritual battles they would inevitably face. But the text also shows how the psychological patterns established through their own conflicts with Satan continued to influence their family relationships in ways they didn't fully understand. Cain and Abel weren't just two brothers with different personalities who happened to get into a fight. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve, they represented different approaches to spiritual development that had been shaped by their parents' ongoing struggles with spiritual discernment. Their conflict was the continuation of cosmic battles that had been raging since humanity's exile from paradise. The text reveals that Satan understood the spiritual significance of the next generation in ways that Adam and Eve didn't fully comprehend. He recognized that if he could corrupt Cain's relationship with God and with his brother, he could establish patterns of violence and spiritual rebellion that would echo through all human history. The murder of Abel wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a strategic victory in a cosmic war for the future of human consciousness. But we're still not at the most disturbing revelations contained in this forbidden book. The psychological manipulation and spiritual warfare we've explored are just the foundation for accounts that challenge our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Because what the conflict of Adam and Eve reveals about the nature of physical reality itself will shake everything you thought you knew about the material world. According to this forbidden text, the universe that Adam and Eve found themselves in after their expulsion wasn't just spiritually different from Eden. It was literally a different kind of reality operating under completely different laws. The text describes how Adam and Eve discovered that matter itself had become hostile to human consciousness. Not just difficult or challenging, but actively resistant to their attempts to create the kind of harmonious existence they had known in paradise. The very atoms and molecules of their new world seemed programmed to decay, corrupt, and ultimately destroy everything they tried to build. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. The forbidden book suggests that this wasn't a natural consequence of their disobedience. It was a deliberate restructuring of reality itself by spiritual forces that understood how to manipulate the fundamental properties of matter. We're talking about consciousness-level engineering of physical laws designed to trap human beings in cycles of suffering that would make spiritual development nearly impossible. Think about what this implies. If the conflict of Adam and Eve preserves authentic insights about the nature of reality, then the physical world we inhabit isn't the neutral stage for human experience that modern science assumes it to be. It's a carefully constructed prison designed by malevolent intelligence to limit human spiritual potential. Every law of physics, every biological process, every chemical reaction operates within parameters established to ensure that human consciousness remains trapped in material concerns rather than developing its divine capacities. The text describes how Adam and Eve gradually realized that their new environment was actively working against their attempts to recreate the worship practices they had known in Eden. When they tried to build altars, the stones would crumble. When they attempted to grow food through cultivation rather than foraging, the plants would wither. When they sought to create beauty through artistic expression, their materials would decay before their projects could be completed. This wasn't just bad luck or inexperience with survival outside paradise. According to the forbidden text, these failures were evidence of intelligent opposition operating through the very structure of matter itself. Satan hadn't just gained influence over human psychology. He had somehow gained the ability to manipulate the physical laws that governed their existence. The implications are staggering. If consciousness can influence matter at the quantum level, if spiritual forces can restructure physical reality to serve their purposes, then everything we think we know about the relationship between mind and matter needs to be reconsidered. The conflict of Adam and Eve suggests that the material world isn't separate from spiritual reality. It's a reflection of spiritual conditions, shaped by the consciousness that interacts with it. But the forbidden text goes even further in challenging materialistic assumptions about reality. It describes how Adam and Eve began to perceive layers or dimensions of existence that most humans never notice. They could see spiritual beings moving through what appeared to be empty space. They could observe energy patterns connecting all living things. They could perceive the influence of non-physical forces on physical events in real time. These weren't hallucinations caused by psychological trauma. According to the text, they were glimpses of how reality actually operates when human perception isn't limited by the spiritual blindness that characterizes our normal state of consciousness. Adam and Eve's exile from Eden had damaged their spiritual faculties, but it hadn't eliminated them entirely. Under certain conditions, they could still perceive dimensions of existence that remain invisible to most people. The descriptions of these expanded states of consciousness read like accounts from modern consciousness researchers studying psychedelic experiences or near-death phenomena. We're talking about awareness of multiple dimensions of reality operating simultaneously, perception of intelligence and intention behind apparently random events, direct experience of consciousness as something far more fundamental than brain activity. But unlike modern researchers who typically interpret these experiences through materialistic frameworks, the conflict of Adam and Eve presents them as evidence of spiritual realities that were always present, but normally hidden from human perception. The text suggests that what we call ordinary consciousness is actually a severely limited state, designed to keep us focused on material survival rather than spiritual development. This understanding completely transforms how we interpret the story of Cain and Abel. Their conflict wasn't just about sibling rivalry or different approaches to worship. According to the forbidden text, it was about fundamentally different ways of perceiving and interacting with reality itself. Abel had inherited more of Adam and Eve's residual capacity for spiritual perception. He could still sense the presence of divine reality operating through and behind physical appearances. Cain, on the other hand, had become more completely trapped in purely material consciousness. He could only perceive the physical dimension of existence, making him vulnerable to spiritual influences that he couldn't detect or resist. The text describes how Satan exploited this spiritual blindness, manipulating Cain's thoughts and emotions through channels that remained invisible to his limited perception. The murder of Abel wasn't just the first crime in human history. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve, it was the moment when purely material consciousness triumphed over spiritual awareness, establishing patterns that would dominate human civilization for millennia to come. Cain's victory over his brother represented the victory of a worldview that could only perceive matter and energy, making humanity vulnerable to manipulation by spiritual forces that operate beyond material detection. But here's what makes this interpretation truly disturbing. If the forbidden text preserves authentic insights about human consciousness, then the materialistic worldview that dominates modern civilization isn't a scientific advance over primitive superstition. It's actually a regression to the spiritually blind consciousness that made Cain vulnerable to demonic manipulation in the first place. The conflict of Adam and Eve suggests that human beings are capable of forms of awareness that can perceive multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously, recognize the spiritual forces that influence physical events, and distinguish between authentic divine communication and sophisticated counterfeits. But these capacities have been systematically suppressed by cultural conditioning that insists only material reality exists. This suppression serves the same purpose that Satan's deception served in Adam and Eve's time. It keeps human consciousness trapped in a limited range of perception that makes spiritual manipulation possible while keeping it invisible to its victims. We become vulnerable to influences we can't detect, manipulation we can't recognize, and control systems we can't even imagine. The forbidden text describes specific practices that Adam and Eve developed for expanding their consciousness beyond these artificial limitations. They learned to enter states of awareness where they could perceive spiritual dimensions of reality directly, communicate with divine intelligence without intermediary, and recognize the true nature of the forces attempting to influence their thoughts and decisions. These practices read like advanced instructions for consciousness development, far more sophisticated than anything most people encounter in conventional spiritual education. We're talking about techniques for purifying perception, methods for stabilizing expanded awareness, practices for maintaining clarity in the face of sophisticated spiritual deception. But the text also warns that these practices are dangerous for people who haven't developed the spiritual maturity to handle expanded consciousness responsibly. Adam and Eve's initial attempts to recreate their Eden experiences often backfired, opening them to forms of spiritual attack that were far more devastating than anything they had encountered in their normal state of consciousness. They discovered that expanded awareness without adequate preparation could make them more vulnerable rather than more protected. The spiritual dimensions they could perceive in altered states were populated by intelligences that understood human psychology far better than they understood themselves. Without proper discernment, their attempts at spiritual development actually increased their susceptibility to deception and manipulation. This explains why the forbidden text was considered so dangerous by religious authorities. It wasn't just that it contained alternative accounts of biblical events. It was that it provided detailed instructions for consciousness development that could either lead to genuine spiritual liberation or to forms of spiritual bondage that were far more subtle and devastating than ordinary material concerns. The Church Fathers who suppressed this text understood that most believers weren't prepared for the level of spiritual development it described. They feared that widespread circulation of these teachings would lead to spiritual chaos as people attempted practices they weren't mature enough to handle safely. Their solution was to eliminate the text entirely rather than risk the consequences of unguided spiritual experimentation. But suppression created its own problems. By eliminating access to advanced spiritual teachings, institutional Christianity left believers defenseless against the very forces that the conflict of Adam and Eve warned about. People lost the ability to recognize spiritual manipulation, distinguish between authentic and counterfeit religious experiences, or develop the consciousness capacities needed for genuine spiritual maturity. The result was a form of Christianity that could provide comfort and community, but couldn't offer the kind of transformative spiritual development that the original teachings apparently made possible. Believers became dependent on external religious authorities rather than developing their own capacity for direct spiritual discernment. According to the forbidden text, this was exactly what Satan's long-term strategy was designed to accomplish. Not the elimination of religion, but the creation of religious systems that would keep people spiritually passive and dependent rather than empowering them to develop their own divine capacities. The conflict of Adam and Eve reveals that this strategy was already being implemented in humanity's earliest generations. Satan understood that he couldn't prevent people from seeking spiritual connection, but he could influence how they understood that connection, what practices they used to cultivate it, and what authorities they trusted to guide their development. The text describes how he systematically corrupted the spiritual traditions that Adam and Eve tried to establish for their descendants. He introduced subtle distortions into their teachings, created counterfeit spiritual experiences that seemed authentic, and established patterns of religious authority that served his purposes rather than genuine spiritual development. These corruptions were so subtle that even Adam and Eve didn't always recognize them. They would teach their children practices that had been effective for their own spiritual development, only to discover that the same techniques were producing very different results in the next generation. What had brought them closer to divine truth was somehow leading their children further away from it. The forbidden text suggests that this pattern of spiritual corruption has continued throughout human history. Every authentic spiritual teaching gets systematically distorted over time. Every genuine religious movement gets co-opted by forces that understand how to exploit human spiritual hunger for purposes that oppose genuine spiritual development. But the text also reveals that complete corruption is impossible. Something within human consciousness remains capable of recognizing authentic spiritual truth, regardless of how sophisticated the counterfeits become. The divine image within human awareness may be damaged and obscured, but according to the conflict of Adam and Eve, it can never be completely eliminated. This recognition becomes the foundation for genuine spiritual development, not the acceptance of external religious authority, but the cultivation of internal spiritual discernment that can distinguish between authentic and counterfeit spiritual experiences regardless of how they're packaged or presented. The forbidden text describes this discernment as a form of spiritual immune system that can be strengthened through proper practice and weakened through spiritual negligence. Like physical immunity, it requires exposure to spiritual challenges in order to develop properly. People who are overprotected from spiritual deception often become more vulnerable to it rather than more resistant. This understanding explains why the conflict of Adam and Eve presents spiritual warfare not as something to be avoided, but as something to be navigated with wisdom and courage. The text suggests that spiritual maturity requires learning to function effectively in a reality where deception and truth coexist, where authentic and counterfeit spiritual experiences are often indistinguishable to untrained perception. Adam and Eve's post-Eden existence becomes a training ground for developing these spiritual survival skills. Every challenge they face, every deception they encounter, every moment of confusion or despair becomes an opportunity to strengthen their capacity for spiritual discernment. Their exile from paradise wasn't just punishment for disobedience. It was preparation for a form of spiritual development that was only possible under conditions of spiritual adversity. The forbidden text reveals that this preparation was essential not just for Adam and Eve's personal spiritual development, but for the spiritual evolution of the entire human race. Their struggles with Satan's deceptions were establishing patterns and precedents that would influence how all their descendants would learn to navigate spiritual reality. But we're approaching revelations in this forbidden text that are so disturbing, so challenging to conventional religious thinking, that they force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the purpose of human existence itself. The deeper we venture into this forbidden text, the more we encounter something that should fundamentally challenge how we understand the purpose of human existence itself. Because what the conflict of Adam and Eve reveals about why humanity was actually created will shake the foundations of everything you've been taught about God's plan for the human race. According to this ancient text, Adam and Eve's creation wasn't the simple act of divine love that most religious traditions describe. The Forbidden Book suggests that human beings were created to serve a specific function in a cosmic conflict that had been raging long before the Garden of Eden ever existed. We're talking about a war between spiritual forces that spans dimensions of reality most people never imagine. And humanity's role in this conflict is far more complex and disturbing than anything you'll hear from a church pulpit. The text reveals that before Adam and Eve were even formed from dust, Satan had already corrupted vast regions of creation through methods that most believers never learn about. He had gained influence over entire realms of existence, turning what should have been sources of divine glory into instruments of rebellion against the cosmic order. The creation of humanity wasn't just God's desire for fellowship with conscious beings. It was a strategic response to spiritual corruption that threatened the very fabric of reality itself. Think about the implications of this for a moment. If the conflict of Adam and Eve preserves authentic insights about humanity's origin, then we weren't created to live peaceful lives in a perfect garden. We were created to be warriors in a spiritual conflict that requires exactly the kind of consciousness development that our struggles in this fallen world make possible. Our capacity to choose between good and evil, our ability to resist deception through painful experience, our development of spiritual discernment through adversity. These aren't unfortunate consequences of the fall. They're the very qualities that made human creation necessary in the first place. The forbidden text describes how Adam and Eve gradually began to understand their true purpose as they struggled with Satan's attacks. They realized that their exile from Eden, devastating as it was, had activated spiritual capacities that remained dormant during their time in paradise. Their innocence had made them powerful in one way, but their experience of spiritual warfare was making them powerful in completely different ways that were essential for the cosmic conflict they had unknowingly entered. We see them developing what the text calls the wisdom of serpents, alongside the harmlessness of doves. They learned to recognize deception not through theoretical knowledge, but through painful experience of being deceived. They developed spiritual strength not through comfortable circumstances, but through maintaining faith under conditions that would have destroyed less resilient consciousness. They gained authority over spiritual forces not through divine appointment, but through proving their reliability under the most challenging spiritual conditions imaginable. But here's where the story takes a turn that most religious authorities would find absolutely unacceptable. The conflict of Adam and Eve suggests that their fall wasn't a tragic mistake that disrupted God's perfect plan. It was a necessary stage in their spiritual development that was always intended to happen. Not because God wanted them to suffer, but because the kind of consciousness required for the cosmic conflict they were created to engage could only be developed through exactly the kind of challenges that life outside paradise would provide. The text describes conversations between Adam and Eve where they gradually realized that their time in Eden was actually a form of spiritual childhood. They had been innocent and pure, but they hadn't been tested. They had been obedient, but they hadn't developed the spiritual strength that comes from choosing obedience under conditions where disobedience seems more attractive. They had been happy, but they hadn't learned the kind of joy that can exist even in the midst of suffering. According to the Forbidden Book, Satan's temptation in the garden wasn't just an attack on human innocence. It was the catalyst for a form of spiritual maturation that couldn't happen any other way. The knowledge of good and evil that they gained through their disobedience wasn't just information about moral categories. It was direct experiential understanding of how spiritual forces operate, how consciousness can be manipulated, and how authentic divine connection differs from sophisticated counterfeits. This understanding completely transforms the meaning of the phrase, "You shall be as gods," that Satan used to tempt Eve. In conventional religious interpretation, this is understood as a lie designed to appeal to human pride. But the conflict of Adam and Eve suggests it was actually a prediction about the kind of spiritual authority that humans would eventually develop through their journey outside paradise. Not authority that competed with divine authority, but authority that served divine purposes in ways that innocent consciousness never could. The text reveals that as Adam and Eve matured spiritually through their struggles with deception and adversity, they began to develop capacities that even the angels found remarkable. They could perceive spiritual realities from perspectives that pure spiritual beings couldn't access. They could understand the psychology of spiritual rebellion in ways that beings who had never fallen couldn't comprehend. They could offer forms of worship and service that were only possible for consciousness that had experienced both divine connection and spiritual alienation. According to the forbidden text, this is why Satan's attacks on humanity became increasingly desperate and sophisticated as Adam and Eve's spiritual development progressed. He began to realize that his apparent victory in corrupting them was actually serving purposes he had never intended. Their exile from paradise wasn't eliminating their threat to his rebellion. It was transforming them into exactly the kind of spiritual warriors that could challenge his authority most effectively. The accounts of how this realization affected Satan's strategies are particularly disturbing. The text describes how he shifted from direct temptation to more subtle forms of psychological warfare designed to prevent Adam and Eve from recognizing their true spiritual potential. He began creating experiences that would keep them trapped in shame and self-doubt, rather than growing into the spiritual authority their struggles were developing. We see him manufacturing false religious experiences designed to convince them that they were spiritually hopeless, that their connection to divine truth had been permanently severed by their disobedience. He created elaborate illusions of divine rejection, designed to prevent them from discovering that their capacity for spiritual connection was actually growing stronger through their trials rather than weaker. But perhaps most insidiously, he began influencing their understanding of spiritual development itself. The text describes how he whispered lies about the nature of spiritual growth, convincing them that spiritual maturity meant returning to their original state of innocence rather than growing into something entirely new. He tried to trap them in nostalgia for Eden rather than allowing them to embrace the unprecedented form of consciousness they were developing through their post-Eden experiences. The Forbidden Book reveals that this confusion about the nature of spiritual development became one of Satan's most effective weapons against human spiritual potential. By convincing people that spiritual growth meant recovering what they had lost, rather than becoming something they had never been before, he could keep them focused on past states of consciousness rather than future possibilities. This pattern of spiritual misdirection, described in the ancient text, feels remarkably relevant to contemporary spiritual seeking. How many people spend their lives trying to return to childhood states of religious certainty rather than growing into mature spiritual discernment? How many seek spiritual experiences that make them feel safe and comfortable rather than challenges that would develop their spiritual strength? How many mistake nostalgia for authentic spiritual longing? The conflict of Adam and Eve suggests that this confusion isn't accidental. It's the result of systematic misdirection by forces that understand human spiritual development better than most humans understand it themselves. The text reveals specific methods that malevolent intelligence uses to exploit human nostalgia, creating spiritual experiences that feel meaningful but actually prevent the kind of growth that would make people truly dangerous to destructive spiritual forces. We see these methods being refined and perfected through Satan's interactions with Adam and Eve's children. The text describes how he learned to exploit the differences between Cain and Abel's spiritual development, using their individual strengths and weaknesses against each other in ways that their parents couldn't protect them from because they didn't fully understand what was happening. Cain's tragedy, according to the forbidden text, wasn't that he was inherently evil or that God arbitrarily preferred his brother's offering. It was that he became trapped in the kind of spiritual confusion that Satan had learned to create through his experiments with psychological manipulation. Cain couldn't perceive the spiritual dimensions of his situation clearly enough to recognize that his anger toward his brother was being amplified and directed by forces that understood exactly how to exploit his particular psychological vulnerabilities. The text reveals that Cain possessed genuine spiritual gifts that could have made him a powerful force for good in the world. But his spiritual perception had been damaged by exposure to forms of deception that his parents' generation had never encountered. Satan had learned from his experiences with Adam and Eve, developing more sophisticated methods of corruption that could operate beneath the threshold of conscious recognition. Abel's death wasn't just the first murder in human history. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve, it was the first successful elimination of a human being who was developing the kind of spiritual authority that could challenge Satan's influence over human consciousness. Abel had inherited more of his parents' residual capacity for spiritual discernment, making him a threat that needed to be eliminated before he could reach spiritual maturity. But the forbidden text reveals that Satan's apparent victory in corrupting Cain and eliminating Abel actually accelerated the development of exactly the kind of human consciousness he was trying to prevent. Adam and Eve's response to their son's murder forced them to develop spiritual capacities they had never needed before. Their grief became a catalyst for forms of spiritual breakthrough that wouldn't have been possible under happier circumstances. The text describes how their experience of ultimate loss taught them to find divine presence in places they had never thought to look. Their struggle with questions about divine justice that had no easy answers forced them to develop trust that could exist even in the absence of understanding. Their need to continue living and loving despite overwhelming tragedy activated spiritual strength they didn't know they possessed. According to the Forbidden Book, this pattern of spiritual development through extreme adversity became the template for human spiritual evolution throughout history. The consciousness capacities that make humans potentially dangerous to destructive spiritual forces aren't developed through comfortable circumstances or easy spiritual experiences. They're forged in the crucible of challenges that would destroy less resilient forms of awareness. This understanding explains why the conflict of Adam and Eve presents suffering not as punishment for human failure, but as the necessary condition for developing forms of consciousness that serve essential functions in the cosmic order. The text suggests that beings who have never experienced loss can't offer certain kinds of comfort. Consciousness that has never been deceived can't provide certain forms of guidance. Spiritual authority that has never been tested under extreme conditions can't be trusted with the most crucial responsibilities in the cosmic conflict between good and evil. But the forbidden text also reveals something that makes this understanding even more disturbing and profound. According to the ancient accounts, Adam and Eve gradually realized that their experiences of suffering and spiritual warfare weren't unique to them. They were participating in patterns that extended throughout all creation, involving forms of consciousness they had never imagined, and serving purposes that spanned multiple dimensions of reality. The text describes visions that Adam and Eve received, showing them vast networks of conscious beings engaged in similar struggles throughout the cosmos. They saw that their particular battles with deception and adversity were connected to spiritual conflicts involving angelic hierarchies, cosmic principalities, and forms of consciousness that existed on scales they could barely comprehend. But perhaps most remarkably, they discovered that their human perspective on these cosmic conflicts was uniquely valuable precisely because of their experience of spiritual failure and recovery. Their fall from innocence and their struggle to rebuild spiritual connection under adverse conditions gave them insights into the nature of spiritual rebellion and redemption that pure spiritual beings couldn't access through any other means. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve, this realization transformed their understanding of their purpose in creation. They weren't just victims of cosmic conflict who needed to be rescued. They were developing into a form of consciousness that could contribute something essential to the resolution of spiritual conflicts that had been raging since before their creation. Their exile from paradise wasn't the end of their useful existence. It was the beginning of their real work in the cosmic order. The forbidden text suggests that this understanding of human purpose challenges virtually every assumption that conventional religion makes about the relationship between humanity and divinity. We're not just creatures seeking salvation from a benevolent deity. We're developing into spiritual beings whose unique perspective on the nature of consciousness, choice, and spiritual development serves essential functions in maintaining the cosmic balance between creative and destructive forces. This vision of human destiny, described in the ancient text, is both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because it suggests that every human struggle with adversity, every battle with deception, every moment of spiritual growth contributes to something far more significant than individual salvation. Terrifying because it implies that the spiritual conflicts we face aren't temporary challenges to be endured until we reach some final state of peace. They're ongoing responsibilities that come with developing the kind of consciousness that can function effectively in a reality where good and evil, truth and deception, creation and destruction coexist in complex, dynamic tension. The conflict of Adam and Eve reveals that Adam and Eve's gradual acceptance of this cosmic responsibility marked the real end of their innocence and the beginning of their spiritual maturity. They stopped trying to return to Eden and began embracing their role in spiritual conflicts that extended far beyond their personal circumstances. They learned to find meaning and purpose not in comfort and security, but in serving functions that contributed to the cosmic struggle between forces that sought to create and forces that sought to destroy. But the forbidden text also warns that this level of spiritual responsibility comes with dangers that most people are completely unprepared to handle. The consciousness capacities that make humans valuable participants in cosmic spiritual conflicts also make them attractive targets for forms of corruption that operate on scales most people never imagine. According to the ancient accounts, as Adam and Eve grew into their cosmic responsibilities, they began attracting attention from spiritual forces that had previously ignored them. Their developing spiritual authority made them valuable allies for some beings and dangerous enemies for others. They found themselves navigating spiritual politics involving hierarchies of consciousness that spanned multiple dimensions of reality. The text describes how they had to learn to distinguish between authentic invitations to serve cosmic purposes and sophisticated attempts to co-opt their developing spiritual authority for destructive ends. They discovered that some of the most appealing opportunities for spiritual service were actually traps, designed to corrupt their consciousness in ways that would make them unwitting agents of the very forces they thought they were opposing. These accounts of cosmic spiritual politics read like advanced science fiction, involving forms of consciousness, technologies of spiritual manipulation, and scales of existence that challenge every assumption most people make about the nature of reality. Yet the forbidden text presents them not as fantasy, but as literal descriptions of spiritual realities that every human being with sufficient spiritual development will eventually encounter. But perhaps the most challenging revelation in the conflict of Adam and Eve isn't what it says about cosmic spiritual conflicts. It's what it reveals about the true nature of physical death and what lies beyond it. Because according to this forbidden text, death isn't the end of human existence, or even the end of human spiritual development. It's a transition into forms of existence where the spiritual capacities developed through earthly struggles can be applied to even more challenging and significant spiritual responsibilities. The accounts of what Adam and Eve discovered about post-mortem existence will force you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about heaven, hell, and the ultimate destiny of human consciousness. But these revelations are so far beyond conventional religious teaching that most people aren't prepared to handle the implications of what this ancient text actually claims about the nature of eternal existence. The accounts of what happens after death described in the conflict of Adam and Eve don't offer the comforting certainty that most religious traditions provide. Instead, they reveal a complex reality where human consciousness continues to develop through challenges that make earthly spiritual warfare look like elementary training exercises. According to this forbidden text, when Adam and Eve received visions of what awaited human consciousness beyond physical death, they discovered that the spiritual realm operates according to principles that most believers are never taught to understand. We're not talking about a simple heaven where good people go to rest for eternity, or a hell where bad people suffer forever. We're talking about dimensions of existence where consciousness continues to evolve, where spiritual development accelerates rather than ending, and where the capacities developed through earthly struggles become essential for navigating realities that pure spiritual beings find difficult to comprehend. The text describes how Adam and Eve learned that their post-Eden experiences were actually preparation for forms of existence that required exactly the kind of spiritual resilience they were developing through their battles with deception and adversity. Their capacity to maintain divine connection despite psychological manipulation, their ability to recognize truth despite sophisticated counterfeits, their strength to continue loving despite experiencing betrayal. These weren't just survival skills for earthly existence. They were qualifications for spiritual responsibilities that extended far beyond anything they had imagined. But here's where the forbidden text reveals something that should terrify anyone who thinks death provides escape from spiritual conflict. According to these ancient accounts, the spiritual warfare that characterizes human existence doesn't end with physical death. It intensifies. The forces that manipulate human consciousness during earthly life become even more active in post-mortem states, using methods of deception that are far more sophisticated than anything possible while consciousness is limited by physical embodiment. Think about the implications of this for a moment. If the conflict of Adam and Eve preserves authentic insights about post-mortem existence, then death doesn't provide relief from the spiritual challenges that make earthly life so difficult. Instead, it removes the limitations that physical embodiment places on both spiritual development and spiritual warfare. Consciousness becomes more powerful, but so do the forces attempting to corrupt it. The text reveals that Adam and Eve's glimpses into these post-mortem realities fundamentally changed how they understood their earthly struggles with Satan's deceptions. They realized that every battle they fought with spiritual manipulation, every moment they chose truth over comfortable lies, every decision to maintain love despite being hurt, was developing spiritual muscle that would be essential for navigating realities where the stakes were far higher than anything they faced in physical existence. According to the Forbidden Book, this understanding explained why Satan's attacks on them became increasingly desperate as their spiritual development progressed. He wasn't just trying to make their earthly lives miserable. He was trying to prevent them from developing the spiritual capacities that would make them dangerous to his influence in post-mortem realms, where his power was far greater than anything he could exercise while they were protected by physical limitations. The accounts of how this knowledge affected Adam and Eve's daily lives are both inspiring and disturbing. On one hand, they gained tremendous motivation for spiritual development when they understood that their earthly struggles were preparing them for cosmic responsibilities that extended far beyond their individual existence. On the other hand, they began to grasp the true magnitude of the spiritual forces they were opposing, realizing that their conflict with Satan was just the beginning of challenges that would continue throughout eternity. But the forbidden text also reveals something that makes these accounts even more personally relevant. According to the ancient descriptions, the post-mortem realities that Adam and Eve glimpsed aren't distant future states that humans might eventually reach. They're dimensions of existence that interpenetrate physical reality at every moment, populated by consciousness that has already undergone the transitions that await every human being. The text describes how Adam and Eve learned to perceive these normally invisible realms during altered states of consciousness, discovering that they were constantly surrounded by beings who had once faced the same spiritual challenges they were navigating. Some of these beings had succeeded in their spiritual development and had become sources of genuine guidance and support. Others had been corrupted by the very forces that were attacking Adam and Eve, becoming agents of deception who worked to prevent other consciousness from achieving the spiritual maturity they had failed to develop. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve, learning to distinguish between these two types of post-mortem beings became essential for Adam and Eve's continued spiritual development. They discovered that many of the spiritual experiences they initially interpreted as divine communication were actually influences from corrupted post-mortem consciousness, attempting to lead them astray. They had to develop discernment that could recognize authentic spiritual guidance, even when it came from sources they couldn't physically perceive. This understanding adds layers of complexity to the spiritual warfare described throughout the forbidden text. Adam and Eve weren't just battling Satan and his demonic forces. They were navigating a reality populated by countless forms of consciousness at various stages of spiritual development or corruption, many of whom were actively involved in the cosmic conflicts that determine the spiritual destiny of newly developing consciousness. The text reveals that some of these post-mortem beings were genuinely attempting to help Adam and Eve develop the spiritual capacities they would need for their cosmic responsibilities. But others were working to corrupt their development in ways that would make them allies of destructive forces rather than servants of creative purposes. Learning to distinguish between these influences required spiritual discernment that went far beyond anything most people develop during ordinary religious education. According to the Forbidden Book, this multi-dimensional spiritual reality explained many of the confusing aspects of Adam and Eve's post-Eden experiences. The conflicting spiritual impulses they felt, the contradictory guidance they seemed to receive, the difficulty of maintaining consistent spiritual development weren't just consequences of their damaged spiritual faculties. They were evidence of their participation in spiritual conflicts involving multiple levels of consciousness with competing agendas for human spiritual evolution. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these revelations is how they reframe our understanding of religious authority and spiritual guidance. If the conflict of Adam and Eve preserves authentic insights about multidimensional spiritual reality, then many of the spiritual experiences that people interpret as divine communication might actually be influences from postmortem consciousness with agendas that don't serve authentic spiritual development. The text describes how Adam and Eve learned that some of the most convincing spiritual experiences, the ones that felt most divine and inspiring, were actually sophisticated deceptions created by corrupted postmortem beings who understood human psychology far better than most humans understand themselves. These beings could create religious experiences that felt profoundly meaningful while actually leading consciousness away from genuine spiritual maturity. According to the forbidden text, this explained why Adam and Eve's attempts to establish authentic spiritual practices for their descendants often resulted in traditions that became corrupted over time. Post-mortem beings with destructive agendas would influence the development of religious systems, introducing subtle distortions that would serve their purposes rather than genuine spiritual development. The accounts of how this spiritual infiltration affected the religious practices of Adam and Eve's family are particularly unsettling. The text describes how Cain's approach to worship became influenced by post-mortem consciousness that appeared to offer spiritual guidance, but was actually leading him toward the psychological state that would make Abel's murder possible. These influences were so subtle that even Adam and Eve couldn't recognize them until after the tragedy had occurred. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve, this pattern of spiritual corruption through deceptive post-mortem influences became one of the primary methods by which destructive forces gained control over human religious development throughout history. Every authentic spiritual teaching would eventually attract the attention of corrupted post-mortem consciousness, seeking to distort it for purposes that opposed genuine spiritual evolution. But the forbidden text also reveals that complete corruption was impossible because something within human consciousness remained capable of recognizing authentic spiritual truth, regardless of the sophistication of the counterfeits. The divine spark within human awareness might be obscured by layers of deception and conditioning, but according to the ancient accounts, it could never be completely eliminated. This recognition became the foundation for the advanced spiritual practices that Adam and Eve developed for distinguishing between authentic and deceptive spiritual influences. They learned to test every spiritual experience against internal standards that couldn't be manipulated by external forces, no matter how sophisticated their methods of deception. The text describes specific techniques they developed for purifying consciousness to the point where authentic divine communication could be distinguished from even the most convincing counterfeits. These practices involved forms of mental and emotional discipline that went far beyond anything most people encounter in conventional religious education. We're talking about methods for achieving states of consciousness where spiritual discernment became so refined that deception became impossible regardless of its source or sophistication. But according to the forbidden book, these practices were also dangerous for people who attempted them without adequate preparation. The expanded consciousness they produced could make practitioners more vulnerable to spiritual attack, rather than more protected if they hadn't developed sufficient spiritual maturity to handle the increased exposure to multidimensional spiritual influences. The text warns that many people who attempted these advanced practices became casualties of spiritual warfare, rather than warriors capable of contributing to cosmic spiritual conflicts. Their expanded awareness made them attractive targets for corrupted post-mortem consciousness, seeking to exploit human spiritual ambition for destructive purposes. This explains why the conflict of Adam and Eve was considered so dangerous by religious authorities. It didn't just contain alternative accounts of biblical events. It provided detailed instructions for consciousness development that could lead either to genuine spiritual liberation or to forms of spiritual bondage that were far more devastating than ordinary material concerns. The Church Fathers who suppressed this text understood that most believers weren't prepared for the level of spiritual responsibility it described. They feared that widespread circulation of these teachings would lead to spiritual chaos as people attempted practices they weren't mature enough to handle safely, while being influenced by post-mortem consciousness with agendas they couldn't recognize or resist. But suppression created different problems. By eliminating access to advanced spiritual teachings, institutional Christianity left believers defenseless against the very multidimensional spiritual influences that the conflict of Adam and Eve had warned about. People lost the ability to recognize spiritual manipulation from post-mortem sources, making them vulnerable to religious experiences that felt divine, but actually served purposes that opposed authentic spiritual development. According to the forbidden text, this vulnerability was exactly what corrupted post-mortem consciousness had been working to create. They understood that eliminating advanced spiritual education from human religious systems would make entire populations susceptible to forms of spiritual manipulation that could operate through conventional religious channels without being detected or resisted. The text reveals that this strategy had been refined through centuries of experimentation with human religious psychology. Corrupted post-mortem beings had learned to create religious systems that provided enough genuine spiritual satisfaction to maintain believer loyalty while introducing subtle distortions that served destructive rather than creative purposes in the cosmic spiritual conflicts that determined the evolution of consciousness throughout creation. But the conflict of Adam and Eve also suggests that this manipulation had limitations. The divine spark within human consciousness might be obscured, but it couldn't be permanently eliminated. Under certain conditions, it would reassert itself, leading individuals or communities to rediscover authentic spiritual practices despite the systematic corruption of their religious environment. The text describes how Adam and Eve learned to recognize these moments of spiritual breakthrough and to support them without trying to control or institutionalize them. They discovered that authentic spiritual development was inherently wild and unpredictable, resistant to the kind of systematic organization that corrupted post-mortem influences preferred to work through. According to the Forbidden Book, this understanding of spiritual authenticity as something that couldn't be contained within human systems became one of their most important insights for their descendants. They learned to trust spiritual movements that remained fluid and responsive to direct divine guidance, rather than movements that sought to establish permanent institutional structures. The accounts of how they tried to pass this wisdom on to their children reveal some of the most poignant passages in the entire text. We see Adam and Eve struggling to prepare Cain and Abel for spiritual challenges they knew were coming, while being unable to protect them from influences they couldn't always detect or predict. The text describes conversations where Adam and Eve tried to explain the complex realities of multidimensional spiritual warfare to sons who had never directly experienced the kind of sophisticated deception their parents had learned to navigate. They attempted to teach discernment practices that required spiritual maturity their children hadn't yet developed. They warned about spiritual influences that Cain and Abel couldn't perceive clearly enough to recognize or resist. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve, this generational challenge became one of the most tragic aspects of humanity's post-Eden existence. Each generation had to learn spiritual discernment through their own painful experiences with deception, rather than being able to inherit it from their parents' hard-won wisdom. The knowledge that came through spiritual struggle couldn't be transmitted intellectually. It had to be earned through personal encounter with the same forces that had tested previous generations. But the forbidden text also reveals that this apparent limitation served essential purposes in cosmic spiritual development. Consciousness that inherited spiritual authority without earning it through personal struggle often proved unreliable under pressure. The post-mortem beings who had become agents of destructive forces were frequently those who had gained spiritual knowledge without developing the character strength that came through successfully navigating spiritual adversity. According to the ancient accounts, this explained why Adam and Eve's direct descendants often seemed less spiritually mature than their parents, despite having access to more spiritual knowledge. They had inherited information about spiritual realities without developing the experiential wisdom that made such knowledge useful for actual spiritual development. The text suggests that this pattern continued throughout human history, creating cycles where spiritual knowledge would accumulate in religious traditions, only to become corrupted when it was inherited by people who hadn't earned the right to handle it through personal spiritual struggle. The most dangerous religious leaders were often those who possessed advanced spiritual knowledge without having developed the spiritual character that would prevent them from using it for destructive purposes. But the conflict of Adam and Eve also describes exceptions to this pattern. Occasionally, individuals would emerge who combined inherited spiritual knowledge with personally earned spiritual wisdom, creating the kind of spiritual authority that could contribute genuinely constructive influences to cosmic spiritual conflicts. These individuals became focal points for authentic spiritual development that could resist corruption even under the most challenging circumstances. According to the forbidden text, recognizing and supporting these exceptional individuals became one of the primary ways that constructive post-mortem consciousness could influence human spiritual development without violating the principles that required each generation to earn spiritual maturity through personal struggle. They couldn't transmit spiritual authority directly, but they could provide guidance and support for individuals who were earning such authority through their own encounters with spiritual adversity. The text reveals that Adam and Eve gradually learned to perceive this kind of multidimensional spiritual support, discovering that their struggles with deception and adversity weren't as isolated as they had initially believed. They were participating in spiritual conflicts that involved vast networks of consciousness throughout multiple dimensions of reality, many of whom were working to support authentic spiritual development despite the systematic opposition of corrupted post-mortem influences. This realization transformed their understanding of their cosmic significance. They weren't just struggling to survive spiritually in a hostile environment. They were pioneering forms of consciousness development that would become essential for cosmic spiritual evolution throughout creation. Their battles with sophisticated deception were establishing precedents and developing capacities that would serve essential functions in spiritual conflicts spanning scales of existence they could barely comprehend. But according to the conflict of Adam and Eve, this cosmic significance came with responsibilities that extended far beyond their personal spiritual development. As they matured spiritually through their post-Eden struggles, they began attracting attention from post-mortem consciousness, seeking allies for spiritual conflicts that would determine the evolutionary direction of entire regions of creation. The text describes how they had to learn to evaluate invitations to participate in cosmic spiritual projects, distinguishing between authentic opportunities to serve constructive purposes and sophisticated attempts to co-opt their developing spiritual authority for destructive ends. They discovered that some of the most appealing invitations to cosmic spiritual service were actually traps designed to corrupt their consciousness in ways that would make them unwitting agents of the very forces they thought they were opposing. These accounts of cosmic spiritual politics, involving multiple dimensions of consciousness, read like the most advanced science fiction. Yet the forbidden text presents them as literal descriptions of realities that every sufficiently developed human consciousness will eventually encounter. The spiritual authority that humans can develop through successfully navigating earthly challenges apparently makes them valuable participants in conflicts that span scales of existence most people never imagine. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of these revelations is their implication that human spiritual development doesn't end with achieving some final state of enlightenment or salvation. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve, spiritual growth continues throughout eternity, with each stage of development bringing new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to contribute to the cosmic balance between creative and destructive forces. The text suggests that Adam and Eve's post-Eden experiences were just the beginning of a spiritual journey that would continue through multiple dimensions of existence, each presenting challenges that would require them to develop new capacities for spiritual discernment, cosmic service, and resistance to increasingly sophisticated forms of corruption. This vision of eternal spiritual development as ongoing challenge rather than final rest challenges virtually every assumption that conventional religion makes about the ultimate destiny of human consciousness. We're not working toward some final state where all conflicts end and all questions are answered. We're developing into forms of consciousness capable of participating effectively in spiritual conflicts that are as eternal as existence itself. According to the forbidden text, understanding this reality was essential for Adam and Eve's continued spiritual development. As long as they thought of their struggles as temporary challenges to be endured until they reached some final state of peace, they remained vulnerable to the kind of spiritual discouragement that corrupted postmortem influences specialized in creating. But when they began to understand their challenges as preparation for eternal cosmic responsibilities, their entire relationship to spiritual struggle transformed. They stopped trying to escape adversity and began learning to find meaning and purpose in developing the capacities that adversity made possible. They discovered forms of joy and fulfillment that didn't depend on comfortable circumstances, but emerged from knowing they were contributing to something far more significant than their individual existence. The conflict of Adam and Eve reveals that this transformation in their understanding of spiritual purpose marked the real beginning of their effectiveness as cosmic spiritual warriors. They stopped being victims of spiritual warfare and became active participants in conflicts that would determine the evolutionary direction of consciousness throughout creation. But the forbidden text also warns that this level of cosmic spiritual responsibility attracts opposition from forces that most people never encounter during ordinary spiritual development. The consciousness capacities that make humans valuable allies in cosmic spiritual conflicts also make them priority targets for corruption by beings whose power and sophistication far exceed anything that operates through ordinary earthly spiritual warfare. According to the ancient accounts, as Adam and Eve grew into their cosmic spiritual responsibilities, they began encountering forms of opposition that tested every capacity they had developed through their earlier struggles with deception and adversity. They discovered that the spiritual discernment they had learned through battling Satan's relatively simple psychological manipulations was just elementary training for conflicts involving beings whose methods of corruption operated on scales and through channels they had never imagined. These advanced spiritual adversaries understood human psychology and cosmic spiritual principles far better than Adam and Eve understood them themselves. They could create spiritual experiences that were indistinguishable from authentic divine communication, manufacture cosmic visions that appeared to reveal ultimate truth, while actually leading consciousness towards sophisticated forms of bondage, and establish spiritual relationships that felt like divine partnership, while actually serving purposes that opposed everything Adam and Eve thought they were working toward. The text describes how Adam and Eve had to develop entirely new levels of spiritual discernment to navigate these advanced forms of deception. They learned that the spiritual faculties that had served them well in their earlier conflicts were inadequate for challenges that operated through their own cosmic spiritual ambitions and their desire to serve constructive purposes in creation. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve, this advanced level of spiritual warfare required forms of wisdom and discernment that could only be developed through direct experience of being deceived by forces far more sophisticated than anything they had previously encountered. They had to learn through painful trial and error which cosmic spiritual opportunities were authentic and which were sophisticated traps designed to corrupt their developing authority. But the forbidden text also reveals that surviving these advanced forms of spiritual deception developed capacities that made them genuinely valuable participants in cosmic conflicts involving the evolutionary direction of consciousness throughout multiple dimensions of reality. Their hard-earned ability to recognize deception regardless of its sophistication or apparent divine authorization became essential for cosmic spiritual projects that required absolute reliability under conditions where even minor corruption could have catastrophic consequences. The ancient accounts suggest that this is why human consciousness, despite its apparent limitations compared to pure spiritual beings, plays such crucial roles in cosmic spiritual conflicts. The capacities developed through successfully navigating sophisticated deception while maintaining authentic divine connection create forms of spiritual authority that serve functions no other type of consciousness can fulfill. According to the conflict of Adam and Eve's growing understanding of their unique cosmic value fundamentally changed their relationship to their earthly struggles and their post-Eden existence. They realized that every challenge they faced, every deception they encountered, every moment of spiritual growth contributed not just to their personal development, but to cosmic spiritual projects that spanned scales of existence they were only beginning to comprehend. This realization gave ultimate meaning to struggles that had often seemed pointless or overwhelming. They discovered that their battles with despair, their conflicts with deception, their efforts to maintain love despite betrayal weren't just personal spiritual challenges. They were contributions to cosmic spiritual evolution that would influence the development of consciousness throughout creation for scales of time they couldn't imagine. But the forbidden text also reveals that this understanding came with sobering recognition of the eternal nature of the responsibilities they were developing. The spiritual authority they were gaining through their post-Eden struggles wasn't temporary power that would eventually be replaced by some final state of rest. It was preparation for eternal participation in cosmic conflicts that were as fundamental to existence as the laws of physics. According to the ancient accounts, accepting this reality required a form of spiritual maturity that went far beyond anything most people develop during ordinary religious experience. Adam and Eve had to learn to find fulfillment, not in achieving final victory over all opposition, but in knowing they were contributing effectively to eternal conflicts that maintained the cosmic balance between creative and destructive forces. The conflict of Adam and Eve suggests that this acceptance of eternal cosmic responsibility represents the real transition from human to divine consciousness. Not divine in the sense of becoming God, but divine in the sense of participating consciously and effectively in the cosmic processes that maintain existence itself. But this transformation according to the forbidden text, also marked the point where Adam and Eve's story became too dangerous for most people to handle. The realities they encountered as they developed into cosmic spiritual warriors involved forms of existence, scales of conflict, and dimensions of responsibility that could overwhelm consciousness that wasn't adequately prepared through similar struggles with sophisticated spiritual adversity. The text suggests that this is the real reason why the conflict of Adam and Eve was suppressed by religious authorities, not just because it contained alternative accounts of biblical events, but because it described ultimate realities that could shatter the psychological stability of people who encountered them without sufficient spiritual preparation. But according to the ancient accounts, these realities remain true whether people are prepared to handle them or not. The cosmic conflicts that Adam and Eve learned to participate in continue to influence human existence, whether individuals recognize them or not. The postmortem consciousness that seeks to corrupt human spiritual development remains active regardless of whether people believe in its existence. The question that emerges from these forbidden revelations isn't whether these cosmic spiritual realities exist. It's whether we're prepared to develop the spiritual capacities needed to navigate them effectively, rather than becoming casualties of conflicts we don't understand well enough to recognize or resist. The conflict of Adam and Eve suggests that every human being will eventually encounter these realities, whether during earthly existence or in post-mortem states, where the limitations of physical embodiment no longer provide protection from multidimensional spiritual influences. The only question is whether we'll encounter them with the kind of spiritual discernment and cosmic perspective that can contribute constructively to eternal spiritual conflicts, or whether we'll become unwitting agents of forces whose ultimate purposes we never learned to recognize. But the forbidden text also offers hope. It reveals that developing the spiritual capacities needed for effective cosmic spiritual participation isn't impossible. Adam and Eve managed to develop such capacities despite facing challenges that would have destroyed less resilient consciousness. Their example suggests that every human being possesses the potential for similar spiritual development if they're willing to pay the price in terms of spiritual struggle and growth that such development requires. The question that remains is whether we're ready to embrace the cosmic vision of human spiritual potential that the conflict of Adam and Eve reveals. Whether we're prepared to understand our earthly struggles as preparation for eternal cosmic responsibilities, rather than temporary challenges to be endured until we reach some final state of rest. Because according to this forbidden text, that decision will determine not just our individual spiritual destiny, but our contribution to cosmic spiritual conflicts that will influence the evolutionary direction of consciousness throughout creation for scales of time and space that stretch far beyond anything most people have ever imagined possible. The implications of what we've uncovered about Adam and Eve's cosmic destiny brings us to a crossroads that every seeker of forbidden knowledge must eventually face. Because the deeper we venture into this ancient text, the more we encounter revelations that challenge not just religious doctrine, but the very foundations of how we understand reality itself. You see, the conflict of Adam and Eve wasn't content to simply describe humanity's struggles with spiritual warfare. It went further, revealing details about post-Eden existence that read like the most advanced metaphysical treatise ever written. We're talking about accounts so detailed, so psychologically sophisticated, that they make modern consciousness research look primitive by comparison. But here's where the story takes a turn that explains why this text was buried for centuries. The Forbidden Book doesn't just describe what happened to Adam and Eve after their exile. It provides what amounts to a field manual for navigating spiritual realities that most people don't even know exist. and that manual was considered too dangerous for ordinary believers to possess. Think about what we've discovered so far. This isn't some simple morality tale about the consequences of disobedience. This is a complex exploration of consciousness itself, revealing how human awareness operates within dimensions of reality that materialistic science refuses to acknowledge. The text treats spiritual warfare not as metaphor, but as literal description of conflicts involving multiple levels of consciousness, operating through methods that bypass ordinary perception entirely. The accounts of Cain and Abel in this forbidden text reveal just how sophisticated these spiritual conflicts really are. While Genesis gives us a brief story about sibling rivalry gone wrong, the conflict of Adam and Eve provides hundreds of pages exploring the psychological manipulation, the cosmic forces, and the generational patterns that led to humanity's first murder. We see Cain not as some inherently evil character, but as a victim of spiritual influences so subtle that even his parents couldn't recognize what was happening until it was too late. The text describes how malevolent forces studied his personality, exploited his insecurities, and gradually shaped his thoughts and emotions in ways that made Abel's murder seem like his own idea. But here's what makes this account truly disturbing. According to the forbidden text, these same patterns of psychological manipulation continue to operate throughout human history. The methods used to corrupt Cain weren't unique to the ancient world. They're templates for how destructive forces continue to exploit human psychology, turning our greatest strengths into sources of destruction. The text reveals that Abel's death wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a strategic victory in a cosmic campaign to establish patterns of violence and betrayal that would echo through all subsequent human relationships. By corrupting the bond between the first brothers, these forces created precedents that would influence how humans relate to each other for millennia to come. This understanding completely transforms how we interpret human conflict. Those moments when we find ourselves inexplicably angry at people we love, when we're driven to hurt those closest to us, when we experience emotions that seem to come from somewhere outside our normal personality. According to this ancient text, these aren't just psychological quirks. They're evidence of ongoing spiritual manipulation, using methods that were perfected in humanity's earliest generations. But the conflict of Adam and Eve doesn't leave us helpless against these influences. Hidden within its dark accounts are detailed descriptions of the countermeasures that Adam and Eve developed for recognizing and resisting psychological manipulation by non-physical intelligences. They learned to distinguish between thoughts that originated from their own consciousness and ideas that were being implanted by external forces. They developed techniques for emotional purification that could clear away the psychological debris that made spiritual manipulation possible. They discovered practices for strengthening their capacity to perceive the true source of mental and emotional impulses. These techniques read like an advanced manual for consciousness development, far more sophisticated than anything you'll find in contemporary spiritual literature. We're talking about practices that could revolutionize how we understand the relationship between mind, emotion, and external influence. The text describes specific methods for what it calls spiritual breathing, techniques that could reignite divine connection in situations where it seemed to have died completely. Not just meditation or prayer in the conventional sense, but practices for generating the kind of spiritual presence that could transform apparently hopeless circumstances. Adam and Eve learned to approach relationships that had grown cold, communities that had lost their spiritual vitality, even personal faith that had been shattered by trauma. And through these breathing techniques, they could often restore life to what everyone else had written off as spiritually dead. But the forbidden book also warns that these practices are dangerous for people who haven't developed sufficient spiritual maturity. The expanded awareness they produce can make practitioners more vulnerable to spiritual attack, rather than more protected, if they haven't learned to recognize the various forms of deception that target heightened consciousness. This explains why religious authorities found the text so threatening. It wasn't just that it contained alternative biblical accounts. It was that it provided detailed instructions for consciousness development that could either lead to genuine spiritual liberation or to forms of spiritual bondage that were far more devastating than ordinary material concerns. The Church Fathers understood that most believers weren't prepared for this level of spiritual responsibility. They feared that widespread circulation of these teachings would create spiritual chaos as people attempted practices they couldn't handle safely while being influenced by forces they couldn't recognize or resist. But here's what makes the suppression of this text particularly significant for our current moment in history. We're living in an age when traditional religious institutions are losing their authority, when people are increasingly seeking direct spiritual experience, when consciousness research is revealing realities that align remarkably with what this ancient text describes. The spiritual hunger that's driving millions of people to explore meditation, psychedelic experiences, and alternative spiritual practices is the same hunger that the conflict of Adam and Eve was written to address. The text provides guidance for navigating exactly the kind of expanded consciousness that contemporary seekers are encountering through various means. But without the warnings and safeguards that the forbidden text provides, many modern spiritual seekers are encountering the same forms of deception that corrupted Cain. They're opening their consciousness to influences they can't identify, accepting spiritual experiences they can't evaluate, and following guidance they can't verify. The text reveals that this vulnerability isn't accidental. The same forces that manipulated humanity's earliest generations have refined their methods over millennia, learning to exploit contemporary spiritual seeking through channels that most people never learn to recognize or question. Modern spiritual movements, New Age teachings, even some forms of psychotherapy unknowingly provide entry points for the kind of consciousness manipulation that the conflict of Adam and Eve warns about in explicit detail. The text describes how destructive forces learn to disguise themselves as agents of healing, transformation, and spiritual evolution. But the forbidden book also provides hope. It reveals that the human capacity for spiritual discernment isn't permanently damaged. Under proper conditions, with adequate preparation, people can develop the kind of consciousness that can navigate spiritual realities safely and effectively. The question is whether we're willing to take seriously the warnings and guidance that this ancient text provides. Whether we're prepared to approach spiritual development with the kind of rigor and caution that the cosmic conflicts it describes actually require. Because according to the conflict of Adam and Eve, the spiritual forces that shaped human history in its earliest days haven't disappeared. They've simply adapted their methods to contemporary conditions, using modern spiritual seeking as a vehicle for the same kinds of consciousness manipulation that corrupted Cain and led to Abel's murder. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're not just talking about individual spiritual development. We're talking about the direction of human consciousness evolution itself. The choices that contemporary spiritual seekers make about how to approach expanded awareness will influence patterns that could affect humanity for generations to come. The forbidden text suggests that we're living in a moment of unprecedented opportunity and unprecedented danger. The barriers between physical and spiritual reality are becoming more permeable, making genuine spiritual breakthrough more possible than it's been for centuries. But this same permeability also makes sophisticated spiritual deception more dangerous than ever before. The conflict of Adam and Eve offers us a roadmap for navigating this critical juncture in human spiritual evolution. It provides both warnings about the dangers we face and guidance for developing the capacities we need to face those dangers effectively. But ultimately, the text forces us to confront a fundamental question about what we really want from spiritual seeking. Are we looking for comfortable experiences that make us feel good about ourselves? Or are we willing to undertake the kind of rigorous spiritual development that can contribute constructively to cosmic conflicts that extend far beyond our individual concerns? Because according to this forbidden book, those are the only two options available. We can either develop genuine spiritual maturity through the kind of challenging practices and difficult growth that Adam and Eve pioneered, or we can become casualties of spiritual forces that understand human psychology far better than most humans understand themselves. The woman and man who were exiled from paradise didn't just survive their cosmic exile. They transformed it into an opportunity for developing forms of consciousness that serve essential functions in maintaining the cosmic balance between creative and destructive forces throughout all existence. Their story isn't just ancient history. It's a template for what every human being must eventually face as consciousness continues to evolve and the boundaries between different dimensions of reality continue to dissolve. The forbidden gospel of Adam and Eve has finally been revealed. The hidden story has been told. The suppressed wisdom has emerged from centuries of burial to offer us guidance for navigating the most critical challenges facing human consciousness in our time. The choice is ours. We can dismiss these revelations as ancient mythology, or we can recognize them as urgent warnings and essential guidance for spiritual realities that are becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. The cosmic conflicts that shaped Adam and Eve's post-Eden existence continue to influence every moment of our lives, whether we recognize them or not. The question isn't whether these spiritual forces exist. The question is whether we'll develop the wisdom and strength needed to navigate them effectively. Because according to the conflict of Adam and Eve, the future of human consciousness itself hangs in the balance. And that future will be determined by whether enough people are willing to undertake the kind of spiritual development that can contribute constructively to eternal conflicts between forces that seek to create and forces that seek to destroy. The forbidden book has spoken. The ancient warnings have been delivered. The cosmic invitation has been extended. Now the story continues with whatever we choose to do next.